All too often, reading the mainstream news is a full mental exercise against psychological manipulation, and today we're going to read the news. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and for those of you who've been watching my channel for long enough, you often know that I was brought up being taught that words are the tools of a lawyer's trade. Words have meaning, they have to be used properly, and the lawyer that can use the words the bestest is going to generally win the case. Words are the tools of a lawyer's trade. They can be used to convince, they can be used to manipulate, they can be used to deceive, and that is no different than in the field of journalism. So in as much as it is important to know how to draft, it is important to know how to read. And we're going to go through a New York Times article just to show you exactly how one has to read that which is crafted with wordsmanship. And once you fully appreciate how you have to read the mainstream media in order to know not just what is being said, but rather what is being implied and how you are being manipulated, you will never read the mainstream media the same again. Now, although it is November 11th, 2020, Remembrance Day, and everybody should take a moment out of their day to remember the fallen soldiers who have fought for our freedom, the only thing people really seem to be talking about are the as of yet undecided presidential elections in the United States and the potential for election voter fraud that might have had an impact on the outcome. And in that context, the New York Times yesterday, November 10th, 2020, put out a piece allegedly investigating the allegations of voter fraud, and the article was entitled, "The Times Called Officials in Every State. No Evidence of Voter Fraud." The headline sets the context and states the conclusion, but as you might already be able to see, the headline says something else a little bit in between the lines. The Times called officials in every state. No evidence of voter fraud. Now, as you might already be able to see, ostensibly in support of their conclusion that there was no evidence of voter fraud found, the New York Times says that they called officials in every state, but they do not say that they heard back from officials in every state. Whereas the headline as drafted might leave some ambiguity on that issue, and that is not an accident. As we walk through this article, I'm going to draw your attention to terms that are purely subjective, matters of opinion that are infused into statements that would otherwise be statements of fact, starting with the first paragraph. The president and his allies have baselessly claimed that rampant voter fraud stole victory from him. Officials contacted by the Times said that there were no irregularities that affected the outcome. The first term that should jump out at your attention is the use of the term baseless. Baseless is a matter of opinion that presupposes a conclusion before we even get started with the investigation. The use of the term rampant is a purely subjective term, so one would not be able to determine if there is election fraud or rampant election fraud, and they do that for a reason as well. The qualification of having stole the victory from him is a purely hyperbolic sort of characterization. It's a figure of speech, but it does suggest that there is intent as opposed to simply a matter of fact. But it is the next sentence that is a piece of wordsmithing gold. Officials contacted by the Times said that there were no irregularities that affected the outcome. Translation, it sounds like the officials that were contacted in fact confirmed the existence of irregularities, but just said that they did not have an effect on the outcome. That is far different than saying that there were no irregularities in the first place. All of this from the headline and the caption underneath. We haven't even gotten to the body of the article, so let's get into the body of the article. But before we get into the article, just remember the conclusion from the headline. No evidence of voter fraud. I'm going to remind you throughout the video, but remember that. No evidence of voter fraud. Now let's read the body. Election officials in dozens of states representing both political parties said that there was no evidence that fraud or other irregularities played a role in the outcome of the presidential race, amounting to a forceful rebuke of President Trump's portrait of a fraudulent election. Notice how this sentence contains both a statement of fact and a statement of opinion. No evidence being one thing is a statement of fact. What role that evidence might have played on an outcome is a statement of opinion. It is a conclusion. And by infusing a question of opinion as a conclusion with the stated fact in the first part of that sentence, they sort of give you the impression that the fact infused with the opinion is a fact in and of itself. The bottom line, we want to know if there was fraud or other irregularities. We will come to our own conclusion as to whether or not it had an impact on the outcome, but the New York Times is sort of merging those two sentences together and not answering the first part of it, at least directly. They are, however, answering the question implicitly by saying that there was in fact fraud or irregularities, but in their opinion, it did not affect the outcome. A very skillful wordsmithing, if I do say so myself.
Well played, New York Times.
Steve Simon, a Democrat who is Minnesota's Secretary of State, said, quote, "I don't know of a single case where someone argued that a vote counted when it shouldn't have or didn't count when it should. There was no fraud," end quote. What does the New York Times' own research on the subject say? Well, let's go see. Quote, Kansas did not experience any widespread, systematic issues with voter fraud, intimidation, irregularities, or voting problems, a spokeswoman for Scott Schwab, the Republican Secretary of State in Kansas, said in an email Tuesday. We are very pleased with how the election has gone up to this point. This is something I've been saying for a while, but when you use subjective qualifiers on what would otherwise be a statement of fact, you turn that statement of fact into a statement of opinion. The existence of fraud or irregularities is far different than the existence of widespread or systematic fraud or irregularities. One can be determined and the other one is purely subjective. What is widespread? What is systematic? Is widespread 50% plus 1? Is it 25%? Is it 5%? Is it 1%? Is it anything that could have had an impact on the election? We don't know. So when someone says there is no widespread election fraud or irregularities, we do not know what they mean. We can never fact check that as true or false. And by always adding these subjective qualifiers of widespread or systematic to fraud or irregularities, it allows us never to have an answer to the question, and it allows the individual never to confirm whether or not there is any fraud or irregularities in the first place.
Moving on.
The New York Times contacted the offices of top election officials in every state on Monday and Tuesday to ask whether they suspected or had evidence of illegal voting. Officials in 45 states responded directly to the Times. For 4 of the remaining states, the Times spoke to other statewide officials or found public comments from secretaries of state. None reported any
Major
voting issues. Translation? Some of them reported issues, just not major issues in the opinion of whoever drafted that sentence. Reporting no voter issues is far different than reporting no major voting issues, especially when 3 of the battleground states were decided by 0.5% or less, give or take. When the results were sometimes decided by thousands of votes, voting issues do not need to be major voting issues in order to be a problem. That, and I will never know what is a major voting issue to one person, a serious voting issue to another, and just a voting issue in general. And I think it might be the opportune time for the classic meme.
But wait, there's more. Hang on to your seat, baby, cause this one's a screamer!
Statewide officials in Texas did not respond to repeated inquiries, but a spokeswoman for the top election officials in Harris County, the largest county in Texas with a population greater than many states, said that there were only a few minor issues and that, quote, we had a very seamless election, end quote. Translation? Texas officials did not get back to the New York Times, but they did in fact have issues which someone qualified as a few minor issues. But remember the conclusion in the headline, no evidence of voter fraud. Now, do you even believe that based on the New York Times' own reporting in this article as of now? For any of you with lingering doubts, let's move on to the next paragraph because it is a thing of absolute beauty in the most cynical of senses. Some states described small problems common to all elections, which they said were addressing. A few instances of illegal or double voting. Some technical glitches and some minor errors in math. Officials in all states are conducting their own review of the voting, a standard component of the certification process. Translation, there was in fact evidence of illegal voting, double voting, glitches in the system, and errors in math.
No evidence of voter fraud.
Based on the New York Times' own reporting, there was evidence of fraud discovered and they tried to minimize it. Look at the terminology that they used to minimize what they discovered as being voter fraud. Some states, small problems, common to all elections. A few instances of illegal or double voting. Technical glitches, minor errors in math. The subjective terminology infused into this paragraph is not intended to inform, it is intended to manipulate and conceal. Now, although I think that was the most egregious example in the article, there are still some other good examples, so let's see them. Quote, many of the claims against the Commonwealth have already been dismissed and repeating these false attacks is reckless, end quote, said Jacqueline Rhodes, a spokeswoman for Josh Shapiro, a Democrat who is Pennsylvania's Attorney General. Quote, no active lawsuit even alleges, and no evidence presented so far has shown widespread problems, end quote. Pay close attention to the highly subjective terminology here. Many of the claims have been dismissed is not all of the claims have been dismissed. No evidence of widespread problems is different than no evidence of problems. It also doesn't help that Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania's Attorney General, tweeted in advance that Pennsylvania was going to go to Biden if all of the votes were counted. In the case of the 2020 election, Mr. Biden's margins in the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are all in the tens of thousands. Even in Georgia, where Mr. Biden leads by more than 11,000 votes, it would be hard to uncover enough voting irregularities to change who won. The interesting manipulative wordsmithing in this paragraph is that the New York Times is referring to numbers of votes in the tens of thousands without referring to the margin of difference between Biden and Trump. Just taking Georgia, for example, although there may be a difference of over 10,000 votes between Biden and Trump, that represents less than than 1/3 of 1% of the total votes cast, so you go ahead and determine how widespread a problem has to be to have an impact on the outcome. And just for total clarity, I am not coming to a conclusion one way or the other. I am just analyzing the New York Times foregone conclusion in the header of the article that there was no voter fraud found compared to the actual body of the article, which makes pretty clear that issues were found. They just, in New York Times' own opinion, would not have had an impact on the outcome. Two very different statements in that one is clearly verifiable where the other one is subjective and not verifiable. At least not for now until further investigation is conducted to determine how prevalent any irregularities were. Moving on to the next paragraph, we see something very interesting in the drafting or phrasing here. Quote, "We have not seen any evidence of fraud or foul play in the actual administration of the election," end quote, said Jake Rollo, a spokesman for Jocelyn Benson, the Democratic Secretary of State in Michigan. What we have seen is that it was smooth, transparent, secure, and accurate. I'm going to reread that, and I want to draw your attention to the term actual. Words have meanings and they are used for a reason, and what does that term mean in the context of this quote? We have not seen any evidence of fraud or foul play in the actual administration of the election. Translation, there may in fact have been fraud or foul play, just not in the actual administration of the election, so take that to mean what you think it means in your own mind. I have no idea what it means. To me, it seems to imply that there was or could have been actual fraud or foul play, just not in the administration of the election, somewhere behind the scenes, somewhere down the road. Again, who knows, but the term actual is a very interesting qualifier in that affirmation. In Ohio, for instance, Mr. LaRose said that while it was not unusual to discover a handful of improprieties in a statewide election, systemic fraud has not happened.
Handful of improprieties, systemic fraud.
He added that while there were likely small instances of fraud, he did not expect it to be significant enough to affect the outcome. Bear in mind, this is the New York Times' own reporting. We have got from the conclusion of no voter fraud to now likely instances of voter fraud to not having had an impact on the outcome to not thinking it's going to be significant enough to affect the outcome. From the headline of the article to the body itself, the New York Times seems to be contradicting its own headline. The article then briefly discusses the Michigan lawsuit, which if you haven't read about, and I suspect you haven't because the media is not jumping all over that lawsuit, I did a vlog breaking it down yesterday. Give it a watch. I'll link it right here. The article then also goes on to talk about the USPS employee who drafted that affidavit, who apparently recanted the content of his affidavit and then apparently recanted his recant of the That's a story in and of itself. I did a vlog breaking down his affidavit. If you haven't seen that, I'll link it right here. Give it a watch. It's a good one. But I think those are the most egregious examples of wordsmithing and manipulation as relates to statement of fact that this article has to offer. So with that said, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
Please, sir, I want some more.
If you want to support the channel, all of the support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube membership. We've got merch for anybody who wants merch, but more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out.